Hi, welcome everyone to today's edition of Table Talk. We have with us Jeanne Dubino from Appalachian State University. She's here to talk about her book on one of my favorite works, Timbuktu by Paul Auster. We are going to discuss her article today on Paul Auster's Timbuktu. Today we have a bunch of us, and this is going to be an edition of Table Talk, which is organized by Indian Animal Studies Collective, which is a group of scholars from India and elsewhere who are working on animals in India and animal-related issues. So thanks everyone for being here. I thought we'd start by just start by asking you what got you interested in Timbuktu in the first place.
Thank you. My interest sort of started before I read Timbuktu. I was in Turkey, and Susan and Sabah have heard this story, and I think I might have mentioned it during Susan McHugh's talk. But I went to Turkey. I taught there in the late 90s. And before I went there, I read a lot of travel books by British travelers in the 19th century. And over again, they mentioned the packs of stray and street dogs. And so that got me interested in dogs and literature. And I'm also friends with Sabah Rashidian, who happens to be here. And we kind of got interested in animal studies probably about 15, 20 years ago. And so one thing led to another, and I became very interested in I became increasingly interested in street dogs. So long ago in 2013, I gave a paper on street dogs in Orhan Pamuk's My Name is Red. And a few publishers asked me if I was going to write a book about them, and I said no. But then I thought, well, why not? So this is most definitely a work in progress. But through that, I started to, I'm using the language of consumption, but I started to devour just about any book I could find on street dogs. And to my great joy and delight, I discovered Timbuktu. And I had already read some novels by Paul Auster, but I found this one to be so charming. So what occasioned the paper that you read was I was asked to go to a paper on travel. And I thought, well, what about traveling animals? And this book very much fit in with that because it is so much about travel. And it really complicates the idea of travel, Auster does, because it's really about traveling not to a destination, but what does traveling mean if you do not even have a point of origin? And so it brings up the very question of homelessness, which is, of course, all about street dogs and so on. So anyway, that's a very sort of long way of getting to how I became interested. And I think Paul Auster's a marvelous writer anyway. So yeah.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the book. Oh, sorry. One of the interesting things about the book is that there seems to be this doubling between the character and the dog. But did you think that the writer did an efficient way of showing that it's as much about the dog as it is about the human protagonist? And, because it's a stray dog, in a way, the theme of homelessness makes as much sense for the stray dog as it does for the protagonist. But how do you think the theme becomes more animal in a way?
That's one of the big concerns. Even as I was setting my book up, I was thinking how much of narrative attention is paid to the dogs versus how much is paid to people. And when I was reviewing my paper, I thought, wait, where does the dog come in? I was spending so much time in the first part, I thought, talking about Willie, gee, Christmas. And then I shifted into Mr. Bones's perspective. I think that clearly, when you write from the point of view of a non-speaking character or persona, the human is going to dominate. But I feel like Paul Auster really does try to get as much into a perspective in a way that those in literature can do. I've always been so moved by one of your pieces, Susan McHugh, on how literature can do so much for animals because it gives us that imaginative perspective that gets us into non-human animals' heads. I do have a friend who objects to writing books, poems, anything literary, imaginative from an animal's perspective. She thinks it's cheap. She doesn't like it, but I feel like perhaps if she read Timbuktu, she might change her mind. I find it interesting that Paul Auster in an interview said he was not necessarily an animal person. And what seemed to have prompted the novel was he was ill when he wrote it. And so he had very much had vulnerability on his mind. And so that kind of position that he had of vulnerability allowed him to kind of think about other vulnerable creatures. So I found that to be quite compelling. But I think ultimately, I mean, certainly he shows animals, non-human animals, human animals on the same kind of plane. I think he does that pretty well. In fact, he's pretty insistent about it throughout the book.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I was watching The Power of the Dog by Jane Campion recently, and I had really high expectations of the movie. Because I could see that it has a lot of horses and so on. But I was really disappointed because though there were a lot of horses, it didn't really seem to focus on them in any way. And I've been wondering about what really the difference between, cinema as a medium and what literature is or seems possible to do. And I'm not sure what you think about this. If literature seems like it's possible to foreground animals in a way, if it is only because it can grant animals some kind of an inner voice, or if it is because they can just show how pathetic or filled with pathos their lives are, or if I wonder if it's simply because of the title itself, the whole idea of Timbuktu and of this realm of afterlife and so on. So what do you think, where does the literariness present itself, and how does it grant the dog some amount of personality and of being a completely radical present being?
I think that what literature can do, what the word can do, is get us more into characters' heads in a way that we can't even do in our relationships with other people. And so, of course, one has to kind of take a leap of faith there. I mean, how can we really know what a dog thinks? There's Thomas Nagel, what does a bat feel? So we feel this greater immediacy, I believe, to Mr. Bones. But I cannot find the article. I was asked for it, but there's a really good piece about how film and art can also capture the animality of animals in a way that literature cannot, because animals cannot talk. And so how do they express themselves? Well, through vocalization, bodily movement, and so on. And so we can kind of grasp them through their whole bodily experience. And yet, of course, animals are staged. And so how much of that staging really reflects the sort of true essence? So even film and art, which can show other dimensions, can't is also limited to some extent. But I believe that I've moved from the English department at my university to global studies, but I still believe in using literary text as a way of getting my students into other brains, other realms, other worlds. And I believe that literature continues to be the best way to do that, and especially for animal studies. When I first started teaching this class I teach every spring called Animal Planet, I was working with a lot of text from anthropology and sociology, but they kind of fell flat. And so now I'm primarily using literary text and memoirs and so on, because I feel like those have a much greater, they teach what I want to teach, and they also entrance the students more than other texts do. Or maybe it's just because I'm in love with literature and I can't tear myself away from it.
You know, I was in the literature department, but in some ways I'm now in the anthropology department. And yeah, I can see what you're saying. And it's such a big dilemma for me as well. And I wonder part of the reason is because in literature, I don't know, it's so confusing to really determine the causes, but maybe you can think with me on this one. If the reason for literature being a more useful way to talk about animals is because it is possible to not hold on to the human subject as the rigid human subject at all times. And there is more room for ambiguity in literature as opposed to, let's say, anthropology, where the human must necessarily be the observer and the note maker and the record keeper, and is therefore in many ways adopting an ideological position. Do you think that has something to do with that?
I think the word that I'm hanging on to there is sort of imaginative space. And yet I also find that when I sometimes teach literary text, I teach them in an anthropological way. I'm teaching ethology, and I'm teaching society and human animal relationships and field research. And so I think that that's one of the great joys of animal studies, is that you can kind of bring it all together. I mean, so many of the humanities and social sciences, history and sociology, even like, women, cats, men, dogs, what do you do with that? And so, I mean, there's, the animal studies is kind of in some ways the best course if you want to, merge it all, because I don't see how you can teach literary text without bringing in, say, studies about animals. I know that when I teach Animal Planet, I have sometimes I'll have conservation biologists come in. One is my favorite, Lynn Sieferman, talks about birds and bird behavior. And when she does, I mean, it opens students' minds up to, how do animals act? And so then when they look at birds in literature, I think that Lynn really enriches their experience and mine. And I see, yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, do you want to just take that question? Because it's an interesting question. It's in the chat. Maybe I can read it out for the audience. Susan McHugh is asking, does literature allow for play with authority and authorship, anthropocentrism in ways that other writing, especially academic writing, doesn't or can't?
I mean, I think so. I think that literature kind of gives a kind of space or a stage in which animals can play out their animality. However, that said, I think that I really think that ethologists, those who study animal behavior, I think that their perspective is essential too. And so I know that even in my dog book, like when I look at, I'm my biggest sort of, I know Turkey better than I know other countries. And so and there's so much literature also on street and stray and free ranging dogs in Turkey. But I know that I have benefited from spending a lot of time there, taking photographs, being friends with a woman who is an anthropologist who has done a lot of field research. And so I think that, they can also help to, that kind of thinking can help to kind of decenter humans. But I think literature is about decentering, the reader's perspective and getting that reader into other heads. And so that's where, again, I'll make that plug for literature, but in hand with other disciplines.
On the last question, probably on this theme, my only worry about this is that sometimes it feels like the emphasis on imaginative space literature as this place for thinking imaginatively about not just what is not human, but about any other kind of being. It seems like those possibilities are always, in a way, in the future than really in the present, whereas what animals need is change in the present, in the now. And in that way, the literary possibility, and I'm sure a lot of political science people may probably say this, a lot of literary possibility seems romantic, or worse, simply impractical. And I think this sometimes about my favorite animal poetry, and I know what that animal poetry is, what that can do, and how generative it is. But then, is the imaginative possibility? So my two related questions are: is it possible? Is it something that happens only in the future? And second, is it dependent on change that can happen to you? So the ambiguity and the challenge to authority and readership and so on, is that supposed to cause a change to the person reading it? Is it dependent on the reader?
I think when I teach global studies classes, one writer I teach a lot is he's a journalist, Nicholas Kristof, who talks about kind of the power of stories to change people's minds. And I know that when I have taught Timbuktu, students will say, I never really thought about that. I mean, about the position of stray dog, we call them stray dogs in the US, and homeless people. And this, maybe I could take us to Auster. Isn't it interesting the way the novel is kind of future oriented, starting with the title, Timbuktu is a place, it's a romantic place. In the Western imagination, it's sort of the farthest kind of destination. And it's a place where humans, animals can kind of communicate in a true and genuine way. And yet the most poignant parts of the book and of the novel that the students really pick up on are when the moments in the present, when Mr. Bones is at his most vulnerable, when Willie G dies and he's looking for a place to eat. He doesn't even know where to, he doesn't even know how to cross the street. He feels completely and utterly bereft. And then there's one passage, I think it's on 88, 80, or I can't remember, 88, 89, where he says, he thinks, well, it's bad enough to be a homeless person, but what about a homeless dog? Dogs have no kind of control. And so I think that this book might be so powerful because in some ways the present is excruciatingly present, not for a long time, but I like the way in terms of temporality, the novel takes place, and I love your question, it takes place in these different planes. You know, there's a real frustration with the present. And so you think you have to imagine a better place, a future. Unfortunately, that future seems to be in the afterlife or in the dream world where you can most connect. But then you can't have a better present without imagining a better future and working toward it. And to start to get people to care, you have to, you know, tell a story and then get people into the story. So I think that there is a kind of ethical, in a way, I haven't seen this as much in other of Auster's novels. There is a kind of ethical push in this one that you know, anyone who writes animal books probably is going to include. Yeah.
Yeah, it really reminds me of one of my other favorite books, Confederacy of Dunces, though that doesn't have any animal characters. We have two other questions. Anu, why don't you go next?
Sure, thanks, Susan. Jeanne, I think also just adding to what we were talking about right now, I find it also interesting how, and this is mentioned in your article as well, adopting a canine perspective leads to or enables a kind of defamiliarization of what is otherwise mundane, everyday well known, so that, one wouldn't really pay attention to it. And the process of defamiliarization makes people actually wake up and take note. And I think that's then sort of like the first step in the process of being able to imagine, going down that path at all. And I find that that comes through really nicely in this novel, because it is as much a story of Mr. Bones as it is of Willie G. Christmas. But the fact that it's narrated from the perspective of Mr. Bones has a certain effect on the reader that it wouldn't have had the narrator been Willie G. Christmas, or had it been through his perspective. So I think that sort of leads to the entire process of pushing for an alternative future, or imagining something that would be better than this, leading to Timbuktu, so to speak. And I had a question for you also, which I'll just pose now. So this novel is, of course, about homelessness and wandering, but it's then logically also about the home. And I wonder what you think of the status that the home has in this narrative, the kind of teleological status that the home has, seen from a multi-species perspective.
Yeah, isn't the novel wonderful in this, in the way it is about home? I cited a critic who noted how much the novel is about migration, and that's something I'm constantly thinking about as well. But I mean, it's about deracination, and then what is home. And so I think that the book kind of takes us from street dogs and homeless people to, of course, Willie G's parents, who escaped Nazi Europe and come to the US, and their perilous escape. And to some extent, I mean, there is another, I mean, it's about ethnicity as well. And it's about the US in a way, about the US as a kind of polyglot country. And it gets us to kind of think about those origins and how sad it is. I mean, I mean, to kind of leave your place. And of course, Mr. Bones comes from shelter. He's adopted by Willie. Willie then likes to roam about the country in the spirit of vagabondage, and then return to his mother's home in New York. And then, of course, when Willie dies, then he seeks out another home for his dog. And then, of course, one thing leads to another. There's Henry Chow, and then the Joneses, and then the final destination. And so I think it's a book that's very sort of much about the kind of multiple perspectives and multiple positions that that street dogs have, and that humans have, and especially in a world of migration in a country like the US, where almost everyone is from somewhere else. I think that, and then, what is that place? I think that Auster does just such a lot in a very sort of short book to kind of, to get readers to think about, well, where are you from? And at the same time, because the book, as you emphasized, Anu, is about Mr. Bones's experience, we realize how vulnerable we all are in this kind of world of mobility. I mean, part of Willie's travels take place in the 1960s, 1970s, when there was, again, getting back to that spirit of vagabondage across the land. But I think it's kind of like a microcosm of a kind of global phenomenon. And so, yeah, I think the book very much interrogates that notion of, what is home.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting that the idea of travel versus vagabondage is also kind of, I mean, the lines are blurred here, because what one would normally understand as travel would be that there is a specific destination that you're traveling to, and like you said, a point of origin that you're traveling from. And here, Willie leads a life of vagabondage. That's his life, besides the winter months that he spends in his mother's apartment. And I think somewhere in the novel, Mr. Bones mentions that travel is when there is adventure. And so for him, travel was the vagabondage, the wandering around aimlessly, so to speak, with Willie. And I find that that sort of blurring of the boundaries really interesting, because it applies, of course, also to humans, and not only in the 1960s.
Yeah, I mean, you have the escape that Willie's mother in particular makes, and then you have the vacation to Disneyland, and then you have flight. And so I think that Auster really gets us to, or challenges us to think about, well, what is travel? What causes people to move, and gets us to realize that, you know, many people are forced to move. It's I could almost teach this class in my this book in my contemporary global issues class, where I focus mostly on migration.
Right. I have some other questions, but I think there was someone else who had a question.
Yeah.
Maybe they'd like to go next.
Yeah, you should just go after that. We have a question from Professor Rukmini.
You see me and hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So I'm a bit of a migrant in this group, so I apologize if my questions really don't have that much of an animal focus. And I haven't really read Paul Auster's, this particular book by Paul Auster. But my question, I have a question and two comments. My question is prompted by a sort of obsession of mine, and by your remark that you often ask anthropologists and people from outside the sphere of literature to comment or to take part in your classes. And I work, so my own work is on narrative theory, linguistics, and my books are in that region, and post-colonial theory. What I wanted to ask you had to do with Charles Darwin, who wrote a book called The Expression of Animals, Expression of the Emotions in Man and the Animals. And Darwin suggests that there is a continuity between animal emotions and animal behaviors and human behaviors and emotions. And he specifically cites dogs, swans, and other animals and looks at their expressions. Very little was known about the brain in Darwin's time. So it's much more of an imagined universe and a continuity that he's looking at. But he thinks the species are not that separate because they have a continuity with each other. So my question was, in looking at the relationship between humans and animals, how do you interpret the Darwinian continuity? Do you think it has a political or a social or even an epistemic resonance with your own work? So that was my question. And I have a couple of comments as well. The comments have to do with other dogs. The first one is Salman Rushdie's dog. And Salman Rushdie, as you know, writes on migration, and particularly the phenomenon of migration in novels like Midnight's Children and so on. And he says that the central figure in his head is actually a dog from the novel The Dean's December, where Saul Bellows' novel, The Dean's December. And what he's saying is that this dog is always asking God a question. And the question is, please, God, can you open up the universe a little bit more? And he thinks that that question is at the heart of literature, that opening up the universe a little bit more. And it comes not from a human being, but from a dog. And I wanted you to comment on that trope. And lastly, I have to say that I've been reading on Timbuktu and writing on Timbuktu a lot of the time. Tennyson wrote, everybody wrote on Timbuktu, but one of my favorite poems is by an African writer, Caribbean writer called Kamau Brathwaite. And he wrote a poem called Timbuktu. And when I read Paul Auster's title, I thought, let me look up this favorite poem of mine on the internet. And lo and behold, I could not find it. So I was thinking that, are there strays in, vanishing points in the world of the internet where a poem just disappears, a great poem just disappears because people have lost interest in it, it is just not there. I finally found it in a 1974 JSTOR article by somebody who was writing on a host of poets, but only half of it, and I can't find the rest. And it's such a beautiful poem that I can recite it from memory from many years ago. So a Darwin question, a post-colonial question about Rushdie's dog, and finally, just a comment about strays.
Thank you. I'm taking notes on your questions. Thank you so much for those great questions. Can I start with your last one? I feel like things are disappearing on the net. I was looking up Baudelaire's The Good Dogs, and which when I first read it a few years, well, probably it was about 7 years ago, it was everywhere. And when I went to just check on it for this talk, I couldn't find it. I finally had to go to Gutenberg, and it wasn't, the English translation was not written in verse form, but I had to really dig around. And so I too am experiencing things vanishing.
Great. I feel so good that I don't feel that I'm completely out on a limb. So thank you.
And thank you for telling me about the poem by Braithwaite, whose work I love. And so I'm certainly, when I go back to revising this paper for the chapter, that is, that's part of my book, I'm certainly going to look up this poem by Braithwaite, and I wonder if Auster knew it as well. But of course, Timbuktu has such a resonance. So thank you for that question. And the others. So why don't I go back to the Darwin, where you're looking at about this interplay between emotions in humans and animals. I think that there is so much interest in the emotions of humans and animals now, certainly in literature. Mr. Bones is a very emotional dog. He's got the emotions of a teenager. He's up and down and up and down. He's very labile, as my friend Meryl, who is a therapist, would say. And so I like the way that Auster, seems to, really kind of be picking up on Darwin and going to town with it. So, and I think that if you look at dog behaviorists, they're very interested in identifying those emotions. But what is so interesting is that getting back to this idea of opening up the universe, I think scientists and thinkers and scholars in so many different disciplines are acknowledging just how extraordinary the other species on the planet are. For example, fish have emotions. They feel pain. They get sad when other fish are taken away from them. We know that elephants do, but apart from the charismatic megafauna, even those creatures who can express emotion on their faces and through their eyes, they do. And I just, in the last month, I saw that work is coming out on how even insects have emotions. So I'm certainly going to dig up those articles and find them. So I would say that Darwin, who is such a genius, is on the mark, and I think that we're starting to catch up with him. So literature, of course, and anthropology, and those who study animals got it very quickly, and then, but not just those in literature. Carrie Roman I can't remember the title of her book, but writes about how modernists were very influenced by Darwin and how he saturates their work. But then there's the thinker, and I think all of us in animal studies know him, Jacob von Uxel, who looks at animal worlds and animal space. And then there's Heidegger, who talks about the different kinds of ways of being. And even with rocks, for example, I mean, there's the kind of space that a rock inhabits, and then an animal, and so on. And so there are books, like, I don't like the title of this book, but I love to teach it, called Trash Animals. And you know how in the West, if something can't be used or can't be commodified, it should therefore be tossed. And that includes human beings as well, if you look at the number of people whom the US incarcerates. So I don't, that's why I'm not really fond. Thank you, stalking the subject. I love that book. So anyway, but in Trash Animals, what the editors have done there is they have looked at the different kinds of spaces that animals who get considered to be trash, the different kinds of spaces that they inhabit. And all of the writers have to use a story. They have to bring in cultural information, historical, ethological, and it's a beautiful book to teach. So I think that animal studies classes also pick up on Darwin. And then getting to Rushdie and migration, oh gosh, I wish I had that. I wish I had a better memory and could remember a beautiful quotation he has about migration. But I mean, that wasn't what you were asking. You were asking about how a dog is asking how we can open up the universe. And that fits in so much with Timbuktu, because Willie G sees an angel in Mr. Bones and reminds us that dog is God spelled backwards. And it's almost like animals, non-human animals, can kind of connect humans to that, that spiritual other. And there's so much of a spiritual dimension in this book. And so I think that idea of opening up the universe, and Timbuktu is kind of a way of expanding that. I think that that's what makes this book, this fairly short book, such a mini kind of, well, I know I might be overstating the case, but a kind of masterpiece, because it does do that. I mean, Auster, who's so well read, is working with so many different kinds of thinkers. And I think that he's kind of doing what Rushdie is advocating there. So I'm not sure I got all your questions. Started with 3, jumped back to 1, and then made my way to 2.
No, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Anu, do you want to ask the rest of your questions now? Or would you like a moment, whatever you prefer? I can't hear you, you're muted.
If you have something to say right now, then just go ahead and I'll come in after you. No problem.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to one of the phrases Jeanne uses, which I think is fascinating. Interspecies travel. I thought that was a really cool phrase to use, Jeanne. And I was thinking about how you draw the connections between what you call interspecies travel and canine memories. And it seems like there is this possibility of, even though so much of Mr. Bones's memories is rooted in the kind of homelessness he's experiencing and the nostalgia he feels for what he had, it seems like there's also the possibility of building new memories as the narrative unfolds, which I thought was unusual, because usually an animal's memories are situated in the past that he shared with an animal or a human. Whereas in Timbuktu, it seems like as the narrative progresses, there's also memories being built in the future. So do you think interspecies travel catches on to all those different dimensions? Just tell us more about this wonderful phrase.
Well, I think that there has always been interspecies travel. I mean, I teach this book called Globalization, a very short introduction, which looks at the history of globalization. And one could argue that we started globalizing, we humans, when we migrated to all 4 corners, I know, of the earth. And so we did spread out. I mean, we basically populated pretty much every area of the earth except for except for some islands and the poles as of 10,000 years ago. But who did we bring with us but dogs? And they were the first domesticated animal. And of course, we brought rats and a lot of other creatures, and now we're increasingly bringing others. But in a way, it's impossible to travel without traveling with others. I mean, think about the white-nosed bat horrible syndrome, which is killing off the brown bats in the US. I mean, we bring animals and species with us inadvertently, and we ourselves are 3 pounds of us, which is the equivalent of the weight of our brain, is not quote unquote human, it's other creatures. And so, anyway, I think that in some ways we have to realize that when we even go from one place to another, we are not, these little islands or, these sovereign beings. We carry so much with us. And I think a lot more work needs to be done on that very idea of interspecies travel. It's kind of easy to do that with dogs. There are dog narratives of people like My Travels with Charlie and other books that I could pull up a list of other books that are about traveling with dogs. But in a way, it's almost impossible to travel without traveling with other kinds of species. And as far as memories go, I mean, as scientists are studying the brain and so on, and not just human brains, I think that, they're realizing that, memory isn't just built into the brain, it's built into other parts of the body. And this is where I see a kind of happy convergence with, us all kind of working together to kind of build on, I think, a really positive kind of knowledge and what we know. But yeah, this book is, it is about looking in the past, dealing with the future, looking ahead to or dealing with the present and looking ahead to a future. It very much is about those different planes of time.
And just connected to that, I wonder where we would locate agency, which is a big loaded word, but any kind of agency or intention in that kind of interspecies travel. Because I was thinking about, invasive species and biological material that's always traveling in a way which causes a lot of issues because of borders and so on. But as opposed to, plants or invasive or pests spreading across borders, as opposed to that, there is a kind of direction or directionality in Mr. Bones's traveling, even though he's a homeless, he's a stray dog and so on. So do you think, what kind of agencies can be located in the case of animals or non-human figures when we're thinking about interspecies travel in that way? Would it always be in connection with humans, for instance?
I think that where we see Mr. Bones demonstrate agency the most is when he makes the deliberate choice to move into that 6-lane highway, when he chooses to go to Timbuktu. Otherwise, he's fleeing. And so I suppose he shows the agency when he could move away from Willie, but instead decides, because of his emotional attachment, he gets so attached to, and of course that's about dogs and loyalty and so on. I suppose he could choose not to stay with Willie when he could run away. But I think that he shows agency when he says, all right, no more I'm not living with the Joneses anymore. And besides, he may have cancer or something. And so he decides to end his life on his own terms. But I think that that question of agency is coming up in interesting ways when we look at, alas, global climate change and how it's forcing animals to move. And so in a way, you can see that, to cooler climate, moving up mountains or moving northward or sometimes moving southward, that they are demonstrating a kind of agency. And so there are people like Steve Budiansky, who says that it's dogs who domesticated us and not us who domesticated dogs, or even people like who's the guy who writes about Michael, not Bittman, begins with a P, but anyway.
Coleman.
Yeah, Pullman, who says that we didn't domesticate corn, corn domesticated us. And so I think that you do see even a number of popular writers like Pullman, like Budiansky, who remind us that we humans are not the only agents in the world. And there are some who object to the term Anthropocene or Anthropocene because it makes it seem as if we are causing, climate change, whereas now the climate is, playing a role. And one of the biggest people who writes about that is one of my favorite writers, Amitav Ghosh, in The Nutmeg's Curse and in The Great Derangement, and who talks a lot. I mean, this is where you get triple O, ontological oriented, anyway, triple O, where you look at the agency of, not even just humans and non-human animals, but of other forces out there, including the earth. So yeah, I think that's a really good question, especially agency in this novel, where, I mean, one of the sad things about being a street dog is you're kind of at the mercy of others and you don't have as much control. But I think that Mr. Bones tries insofar as he can to exert some degree of control.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, and please feel free to anybody if they want to participate in the discussion or ask a question connected to it, just feel free to unmute and start speaking. But to go back to the question, Jeanne, I was thinking about this, how Mr. Bones eventually has to choose death at the end of the novel, and I thought it made sense when I first read the novel for the first time, but I'm not so sure now because it seems like it's a noble way to locate agency in death in some ways, because that is what makes a lot of sense. For example, Paul Gilroy talks about this, and Achille Mbembe also talks about this, about how slaves in the past had chose death, or in the present, the suicide bomber chooses death. And that is where they locate their agency and where they can speak back because there's no other way to speak back. And I was thinking about this in connection to animals. And in a way, it is so hard to, kind of superimpose that model for animals, because you can't really say that the animal chose to die in real life circumstances. Instead, what you can probably say is that, as you were suggesting, the animal moves or chooses to migrate elsewhere. But then again, the question is, did the animal really choose to go there, or was he simply forced to go there? And so I'm wondering if you think there are any real alternatives other than choosing death in the case of real world animals, because it's such a difficult question for me, or how one may think about it. Because I'm thinking, in anthropology or multi-species ethnography, what people do is to locate agency in all these small sorts of, like small gestures, and say that, if a dog pulls back, then that's resistance and so on. But I find that also, maybe simply because we're working with different categories here, but I find that also inadequate theorizations of agency. So I guess my simple question is, if you think death is a good answer to this question of agency, and if there are other alternatives, such as could Mr. Bones have done anything else by the end of the novel?
Thank you for that comment. I think about, gosh, I don't want to give away the plot, but The Awakening, when Edna Pontellier chooses to, walk into the ocean. Is she showing agency by rejecting her life? But of course, the novel is just like Timbuktu, is a critique. In the case of The Awakening, it's a critique of patriarchy. And in Timbuktu, in some ways, it's a big critique of modernity. I mean, you think about street dogs, streets are so inhospitable, especially in the US, where I mean, it's very dangerous. I mean, if you have small, narrow streets, you're not going to have as many, say, accidents. And so some of the most terrifying moments that Mr. Bones experiences are when he tries to cross a busy street in Baltimore. And then, of course, there's that hideous 6-lane highway. And in a way, it's a kind of a critique of how the modern world is so inhospitable to living creatures. I think about the Prime Minister of Turkey, Erdogan, who really loves big construction projects. And there's a wonderful movie, I know that probably a lot of you have seen it, Kedi, which means cat in Turkish, but it's about this incredible relationship Turks have with their cats. It's a beautiful movie. But this is going to be disrupted by all of these massive building projects that Erdogan has for Istanbul, and which basically involve plowing over neighborhoods where the cats and people live and replacing them with these sterile high-rise buildings and so on. So I think that that the end of this book is very much a criticism of modernity. But you wanted to ask about like agency. I mean, I think that in a way, just through evolution, dogs have shown their agency. And again, I go back to that Stephen Budiansky book. I mean, think about how we live our lives around our dogs and how we shape our lives according to our dogs. And so in a way, it's not a kind of conscious agency, but just by being there, there's this ongoing kind of, I mean, I'm not sure if this answers your question, but it's sort of kind of inscribed or suffused into the kinds of relationships that we have, where we have to, live with these dogs and adjust our lives accordingly. And even if it's not intentional, it's still there. I don't know if that answers, but I'd say evolutionarily, we have kind of, learned to live with these other creatures, we humans.
Okay, thanks. I think that's a good answer. Susan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I have a strange bridge here with this question of death and choosing death as exerting agency, because at the back of my head, Jeanne, when you started by saying that Timbuktu, like Flush, is a favorite, it's one of my favorites, both of them are, and they are also both one-offs for both authors in terms of they are the only dog books they've written, and some literary purists would say these are the riskiest books they've written because, the stereotype is that animals are cutesy, non-serious, non-literary subjects. And I'm thinking of several other authors too. Again, a very favorite books of mine, J.R. Ackerley's My Dog Tulip, Mark Doty's Dog Years. Again, these are one-off dog books for these authors. Rukmini's question also makes me wonder, where is Salman Rushdie's dog book? Is that going to be written? Is that going to be written? Or would he consider that to be, too risky for him? Is that something that isn't possible? I wonder, Jeanne, you've been thinking about and collecting these dog stories for a very long time. So I'd really like to hear more about your reflections on what this adds up to and whether that's changing or whether that's something that, is it specific to dogs even? The authors, is there something too campy or too cheesy or too dangerous about dogs that means risks the death of the author in a very different sense from what Roland Barthes had in mind?
Well, it's the risk of not being taken seriously, and even authors don't. You know how Woolf kept calling her book Flush a joke, and And Auster, even though he's written this beautiful book, I mean, in interviews, he does say, well, it's like he wants to distance himself from it. Well, I'm not necessarily an animal person or a dog person, but I was feeling vulnerable, therefore I wrote this book. And so you can kind of even see how authors themselves, and of course, if you look at book reviews over and over again, I mean, I'm thinking of the review of Edgar Sawtelle and even by Dave Wroblewski, which I think is a really beautiful dog book. But if you look at reviews, I mean, the literary establishment, as of at least 10 years ago, has not been taking these books about animals seriously. And even, you're right, authors seem to kind of want to distance themselves, that they themselves, even as they write in these incredible ways. But I think that with us teachers and with, I think about the Pope who just chided us all for caring about who is adjuring, telling people they should have children and not pets. I think that, I think that there's a kind of still a response. I mean, it's anthropocentric that, humans matter and the rest doesn't. In fact, I'm listening to this. I like mystery novels. And anyway, it doesn't matter. I want to jump away from that. But this idea that, of course, humans matter more than animals. I think that we need to say, well, we're here on this planet, and that's why we need to keep being in the classroom and teaching. And I want to pick up on Zabah's point about agency as an inheritance of Enlightenment thought. Maybe we need to question our presuppositions about agency, liberation, et cetera. It seems to come with ideas of individuality and nomads and monads. And so that's getting back to that question there. But yeah, I think that our work in animal studies, I think we still have to kind of make a case. There's a beautiful book on the melancholy dog where by Elizabeth, I think Kutzner, who writes about in the introduction to the book, she's a Germanist, she's a scholar of German literature culture, but she spends the first few pages talking about how much she was not taken seriously. And so even we literary scholars, and you must get this all the time, all of you who have written anything about animals, we all know well how hard it is to get us to be taken seriously. But I don't care, I'm going to keep at it.
Anu, you had a question, and I think then Professor Rukmini. Yeah, go on, Anu.
Thanks. Yeah, Jeanne, I had a question and then something of a sort of a comment based on what I read in your article. So my question first, if we look at Willie as an embodiment of the wandering Jew in this novel, and we say that he mirrors the suffering, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus, and Willie and Mr. Bones seem quite like a couple somehow in the narrative. Would you say that Mr. Bones kind of undergoes the same fate, and what would be this fate? What would be his, for example, his suffering, crucifixion, and resurrection? And my comment or my observation was again triggered by one of the footnotes in your article, where there was a reference to Lukács, and I had the feeling that this, if we read Lukács from a multi-species perspective, then this text seems almost tailor-made to kind of explain Lukács to undergrad students, because so much of this, I mean, this whole idea of all philosophy being homesickness or nostalgia, and the novel being an expression of this transcendental homelessness, it's like, it's all there, for anybody who's grappling with the non-concreteness of the idea. This is it. It's right there, And in Timbuktu, in this novel, this is really more than the metaphoric homelessness of the, let's say, the postmodern narrative, because it is actual homelessness. And there is a search for this transcendental home in a world in which this quest can't be fulfilled because the world's become so prosaic that the paths to this transcendental home have become impassable. And so I was just thinking how we know that Willie believes when he dies, he's going to Timbuktu, but we have no way of knowing for sure whether he gets to Timbuktu. We just know he believes the afterlife is Timbuktu. So yeah, sure, one assumes he gets there. But whether it is really this realm that he imagines where man and dog would be able to communicate because they would be equals, whether it's really like that or not, we never get to know. And then at the end of the novel, where Mr. Bones dashes into the 6-lane highway, and we know it's his way of trying to get to Timbuktu. Again, the novel ends and we don't know if he makes it there. And it just really seems to me like, God, I wish this novel was in German. I would use it in my classes and it would make my students understand Lukács so much better.
Yeah, when I was writing this, I was, really focused a lot on homelessness, and I was just searching around. And when I found that, I thought, oh my gosh, that works so well. So yeah, I mean, Auster's such a philosophical novelist, isn't he? And so it's just really neat to see the way he kind of packs it into this book. But does he make it? I mean, I think that's sort of what Christianity is kind of about. I mean, this belief, and, is it there? I don't know. You just have to believe. Over the pandemic, I finally was one of the many US Americans who watched Ted Lasso, and one of his shibboleths is the word believe. And so in a way, this novel kind of is about, taking that leap. But I mean, I think for us in animal studies, we want to be, those of us who have animals and those of us who love animals, we want there to kind of be a world where we can live together. And so you have to have that kind of belief. It's a kind of heaven in itself, is living forever ever with your dogs or cats, in the case of you, Pink Sue.
I think, we're almost out of time, but I think Professor Rukmini had a question or a comment, and maybe we can have a final comment or question for somebody. Go ahead.
Yeah, mine was quite a simple comment, which is that, when linguists like me work on evolutionary theory, one of the realizations we have is that written history and the record of human history as far back as we can take it is only 6,000 odd years, 6,000, maybe 7,000 years old, because you have no written records before that, and obviously no possibilities for literature. And one of the problems that I'm working on is, was there narrative before there was any kind of recorded history? But one of the problems is, in relation to today's talk, is that questions arise constantly. Why were dogs domesticated? Why were certain animals brought into the human purview? And one possible answer that brings together the notion of memory and agency is that dogs have the types of memory which are very different from human memories. For example, their memories, because the way dog brains are specialized, their memories have to do with smell to a large extent, which in human beings is very reduced. And so territorially, it made sense to domesticate dogs because it extended the human sensual perception, sensory perception, so that the dogs could guard them and use senses that were not available, or very largely not available, to human beings. And so in some ways, agency itself may have to be looked at differently if one looks at what human beings can do, what are their evolutionary and other capabilities. They can write, but they can't smell very well or whatever. That when you have a merging of capabilities, then you have something like the beginnings of civil society or societies of tolerance. So I just wanted to make that comment to do with memory and agency and the study of evolutionary histories, which are much longer term and go back 1,000,000 years or so, from bipedalism and so on. And often when we read literature, and I'm like an aficionado, I read at least a couple of novels a week, and I find that, but what happens is we get limited to this very narrow history, this history where the human being is central because we're trapped by writing, we are trapped by certain types of narrative, and that takes us away from much longer links that we may have had in prehistory.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at prehistory, you realize that agency is not monadic. I mean, we've always kind of been post-human subjects. We can't just
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, the dogs are an extension of us, but we are an extension of the dogs, and so there has been this, and there is a lot of interest in, I think of Donna Haraway, and then Elizabeth. Oh gosh, the 15,000-year history of dogs. Anyway, if you look that up, I mean, all the different books on, how humans and dogs arose together remind us that, our lives are very much connected and dependent, our human lives, on other creatures. And I think animal studies is about resurrecting that history and reminding us of that. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, did you have anything else to say? Sorry if I interrupted.
Oh, no, I just want to thank you all for, I want to thank you, Susan, and you, Anu, for inviting me to be part of this. I love Susan's talk. I love the discussion, and I got so many great ideas for my book, my book, and just in life. I mean, especially the titles and so on. But thanks for your questions too, and giving me the chance to talk about a beloved favorite. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe we will just stop with one last question, which I really have to ask you, because when I read the text, I don't know, I just read it as a dog novel, and I was just looking at Mr. Bones, but it was only when you mentioned about how you can see the migration and how you can possibly teach it in a global studies class and so on, that I realized that it could easily be taught in other classes as well. And then I was thinking, if Auster chose the stray dog, because the stray dog is such a good metaphor in a way to lend to all those themes, and if the stray dog is in that way such a contemporary figure, and if that's the reason it can be taught to discuss migration and so on, and not because Auster cared about dogs at all. Do you think that's the case?
I think that he was feeling very ill, and I don't know why he chose a dog to kind of represent his state of mind at the moment. But I think he was thinking a lot about vulnerability, and that got him to think about homelessness. And there's a good article in the Smithsonian. In fact, I can put the link in the chat right now. But it's about a vet who teaches, here, let me just put this in there right now. It's about a vet who treats the animals of people who live on the street. And so if you think about street people in the US, it's just horrible. We have 333 million, richest country in the US and the world, but over 500,000 homeless people who are homeless. And out of those, about 10 to 25% have pets with them, not just dogs, but cats, rats, and so on. And so I think that Auster, living in New York, would see homeless people with their dogs. And I'm sure it's, if I were to talk with him and say, was it that sight that made you think about your own vulnerability? And so it wasn't that the homeless person was the most vulnerable, but maybe the dogs whom he saw with the homeless. So anyway, that might have been what really got him thinking too. So anyway, yeah, I'm just guessing.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks a lot, Jeanne, for accepting our invitation. It's been such a great talk, and it's been lovely talking to you. And thanks everyone for being here. We'll hopefully see some of you, or at least, or maybe all of you, in our next talk, which is, I think, on the 21st. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.